Hello, everyone. Hello, welcome to our 7th episode of Wolf School Season 2. This is a bonus episode. It's an extension of the 6-episode webinar series that we delivered to you in the spring. We'll give it about a minute to let people arrive and settle into space. If you are calling in from YouTube, you can use the chat function to participate in this talk today. So as you sign in here, please let us know where you're calling in from, whose ancestral territory you might be on right now. It's always very interesting to hear where folks are situated when they join our webinars. If you're tuning in for the first time, welcome. My name is Chelsea, and I work with Raincoast Conservation Foundation. For those of you who tuned into Wolf School back in April and March, or March and April, it's so great to have you back. If you missed any of our first 6 episodes of this season, you can find all of the recordings on our YouTube channel, which if you're watching from now, if you're watching live, it's the channel that you're watching from. You can also find our first season of Wolf School on this channel or on our website at the link below. All right. Well, we've got some folks in the audience that I can see from Vancouver, Washington, Oregon, Finland, and Victoria. Great. Okay, well, we've got a lot of interesting topics to cover today. So I think we're going to get started here. Feel free to use the chat as you come in. But yeah, let's get started. So to everyone who's watching, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Chelsea Greer. I work for Raincoast Conservation Foundation as director of our wolf conservation program. Today, I'm hosting you from the shared unceded territories of Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish peoples, also known as the city of Vancouver in Canada. As a settler of English and Scottish descent, I just want to first express my gratitude and appreciation to be here working and living and talking to all of you from this unceded land that remains rich with history and stories that have occurred for thousands of years. So again, we have a lot of exciting topics to cover today, so I want to jump right in and bring our guest speakers in. Welcome, Jen and Brian.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Can both of you introduce yourselves so folks know a little bit about you? And also, we are all spread out amongst different coastlines today, so if you can share a little bit about where you're calling in from.
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jennifer Walkus. I'm with the Wekenook Nation in Rivers Inlet. I'm currently on our Katite Indian Reserve, which is on the Wannock River. It's a little community of about between 70 and 90 people. And we live we're flying only or boating only, so no roads. We have our own standalone mini hydro that we put in, trying to be a little bit more environmentally conscious. And we pretty much live with the wildlife right within the community. And I just grew up this way. So coming back and forth between here and Vancouver just let me experience both worlds.
Thanks, Jen. My name's Brian Faulkner. I've been working with Raincoast since the 1990s. I am calling in from the traditional territory of the Nanaimo people on Protection Island in the city of Nanaimo. And I've been here for about 18 years. I started Raincoast's Marine Operations Program a number of years ago in the early 2000s. And I currently am director of the project to purchase and basically operate the commercial hunting territories throughout the Great Bear Rainforest in order to protect coastal carnivores.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jen. Jen, I was wondering if maybe we could start by you giving us a bit of a sense of what your territory looks like in terms of the current presence of wolves and bears and other predators.
Okay, like I said, we're just a little community of about 70 people, and so we have wildlife within the community. The wolves are usually more respectful. They don't come into the community, largely because we have the grizzly mums and their cubs, and then sometimes the teenagers right after mom has kicked them out. But you definitely see and hear wolves all around the community, and it's a different lifestyle when you live somewhere that you know you're going to be sharing space with wildlife, and that you can do it in a respectful manner so that you're both safe. We've definitely had times where wolf packs have lived close to the community, and the community is a lot more understanding, I guess, sort of the types of interactions that we have. We have a lot of outdoor dogs because our dogs usually tell us where the bears are inside the community. So that way we know where is safe, where isn't. And so we have, I wouldn't consider them feral dogs because they're fed, they have homes, but they're definitely outside a lot more. And when wolves have been known to, well, and cougars, any of the larger carnivores have, we've definitely lost a few dogs to those. But it's also a price of living up very remotely where you have humans and wildlife interacting a lot more closely than you would in the city. And when that happens, we've been really understanding of how that happens, unless it starts causing human losses, which we've only had one grizzly bear attack in living memory. So considering how closely we live with them, it really shows that you can live with predators in a way that is respectful for both of your spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, I really wanted to kick off this discussion too by really highlighting your nation's approach to coexistence and managing food resources, not only for people, but also for bears and wolves. So would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
What happened in 2000, we had a salmon collapse. So the year before we had 300,000 sockeye come back. That year we had something like 1,500 sockeye come back to the whole Owikino Lake system. And it's like a 40-mile long lake with 5 salmon streams. Traditionally, we used to get between 2 and 6 million sockeye. So having this happen meant that a lot of things didn't get enough to eat. Bears didn't get enough to eat. Wolves didn't get enough to eat. Eagles, everything was suffering. Like the eagles laughed. They weren't getting enough here. And the bears were starving. Conservation put down something like 7 bears. And when it became clear that that was all they were going to do, we said we would much rather just do it ourselves and put them out of their misery because they were emaciated. And so we'd always lived with bears and wolves and cougars in our midst. But when that happened, it really underlined for us the importance of controlling how we behave for the safety of other critters. So we started doing garbage pickups right from the door 3 days a week. We still do that to this day. So that's been 23 years. During food season, we don't want garbage left outside to bring bears in. So you pick up right from the door. When we have salmon dips, like the way the salmon populations go, especially now, it's very much up and down. And when you have a poor salmon season, it means everything doesn't have enough to eat. And so what the community had wanted to do is we wanted to figure out ways that we could live and plan for ourselves and any commercial fisheries we might participate in a way that makes sure we leave enough food for the carnivores. Because what was happening is when we didn't have enough food, things were coming into the community and looking for food here. So we said, we're planning things poorly. We need to figure out something else. So we worked with Raincoast. We had a researcher up here doing bear hair analysis for DNA. And that could tell us what percentage of marine diet they had. It could tell us what percentage of land-based diet that they had. And so it gave us a way of judging just how much our bears in particular rely on salmon. And so once we did that, we'd started working with Megan early on. She was just going to do her, she was going to do her master's. But the questions that I had were things like, how many bears are there, which we could get to, but is there a way to tell how much bears eat salmon? Like, how many salmon do we need to put aside for bears? And so Megan, as a part of her thesis, plotted the growth of bears against the growth of salmon populations. And instead of planning the way DFO currently plans for, we wanted to ensure that we were leaving enough fish in our planning processes for the wildlife, because my concern was when we don't have enough fish for predators, that once they get into the stream, people only manage what people take, but they don't think about other species. And so when they get into the stream, if you have more bears than you're thinking of, or wolves than you're thinking of, eagles, everything relies on salmon at that time of year. And so then they take what they can get. And if you don't leave enough in the system, that means they're starving, and then they're coming to community. So she ended up rolling over into a PhD just so that she could get enough data to answer these questions. And we really were grateful in her being able to find continued funding and in the support that we had from UVic. And so when that happened, we were still noticing things like not having enough food when salmon collapses. Is there anything else we can do? Because the community always wanted to feed the bears. Once there wasn't enough and the bears were coming in and they were starving, and you could tell how skinny they were. They were bringing their little cubs and you could see how skinny they were. And so the community had always wanted to provide food for bears, like empty out your freezers, freezer burn fish, whatever you could. But that really isn't a sustainable way of ensuring that the wildlife has enough to eat. So we started looking at other options, and we started to work with the University of Waterloo. We work with a researcher named Sarah Wickham, and we're working with her on reinvigorating crabapple groves, because one of the easiest ways to tell if it's an old community is the presence of crabapples. And some of these are really large, well-managed groves. They haven't been for years now, but you can still see the remnants of it. And so we wanted to get them producing again, because crabapples become right at the same time the salmon would be coming into spawn. And so if we could create not artificial, because they are natural food sources, they're within a bear's natural diet. And if we could create these spaces where it could drag them out of community, it meant that we were safer. It gives us opportunity to gather crabapple for our food, and it also creates spaces that the wildlife has other ways of finding places to eat. And it isn't just bears who use it. All sorts of wildlife do. And once you start pulling in the things like the birds and all the other smaller critters who come and eat, then you'll bring in a lot more of the predators, like the wolves and the cougars. And so it just creates these little habitats that are away from community and safer for everybody. And so we're really very much aware that we have to plan what we do, not just for our sustainability, but for the resources that live around us, because we won't be here without the resources that are around us. And unless we find ways to create sustainability for both of us, the earth will still be here, but I think it's people who are going to have a hard time when things change too far.
Yeah, I'd absolutely love to comment on that approach versus the Ministry of Wildlife approach, and the government approach to dealing with interactions with predators. And there's still this consideration that is completely dominant in the ministry, that predators need to be managed, and managed means that you basically kill them. and you kill them if you consider that their numbers are too high, if you consider that their interactions are endangering a community. There's no question about understanding what's going on in the ecosystem around. It's just this incredible knee-jerk reaction. As Raincoast's head hunter, that was one of the main reasons that we decided to pursue this project of purchasing these commercial hunting territories, because we were the ones, we being guide outfitters, and I use that in air quotes because I'm a pretty lousy guide outfitter, but the guide outfitters and hunters are used to control populations. And so with wolves in particular, you're not even required to get a species tag. You're just basically encouraged to kill every wolf that you see, as part of this philosophy that they are dangerous and need to be managed. And we don't do that with all predators. We do that with large carnivores because they tend to eat things that we want to eat. We don't do that with avian predators because we don't care that they eat some of the things that they do. So it's a pretty selective management protocol, and it's so completely and utterly human centric, and it so completely disregards the structure, the family structure of a wolf pack. It so disregards the individual rights, the individual personalities of wildlife. And so it just becomes, essentially, they are classed as vermin within the ministry. And so you contrast that whole approach to the Wikinu approach, which is, these are brothers and sisters. These are people who share the land with us, and we need to share the resources. We need to understand if there's something unusual happening. We need to figure out why. We don't knee-jerk react that. And this idea that the hunting community has been fed and propagates that if you hunt things, they become wary of humans, that they won't come into your community. They'll be afraid of humans. That's been completely dispelled by science and also by experience. Um, Research shows completely that, as happened in Jen's community, in times of scarce resources are when negative interactions with wildlife take place, because they're looking for food and they're looking where you are. They didn't have to before. So Jen's community approach to saying, okay, well, let's make sure that there's crab apples for them. Let's make sure that there's enough for us and for them. Let's make sure there's enough salmon for them. It's just to me, it's the gold standard of how we should be working towards coexistence. And, it's why we set up to buy these commercial hunting territories, is that we want to have, on an ecosystem-wide basis, on a large-scale landscape basis, functioning ecosystems where predators are welcome and where everything that they provide for an ecosystem, which is just keeping so much of it intact, so much of it healthy, and recognizing all of their contribution to an ecosystem, as opposed to killing them because they eat what we like to eat.
I think it's also about understanding that they have a place in that ecosystem. Because one of the things that I always worry about is if we take out large predators and then they're keeping a population, like what happened with sea urchins. You have these sea urchin barrens now because the sea otters used to eat a lot of the sea urchins, and then when the sea otter population crashed, all of a sudden the sea urchin population took off, and they created these huge dead zones in the ocean called urchin barrens, because the only thing that's there are urchins. And when we take out something that we don't understand how it interacts with everything else around it, then we can be creating larger problems than we know about. And the fact that we only try to control the top end of things isn't where population comes from. Population comes from the lower end of the pyramid. You aren't going to have a healthy top of the pyramid when the bottom of your pyramid is a really small space. So like all the feeder fish, all of the environmental resources that are being impacted by industry. And I do realize we have to have some industry. We live out here. We have to be able to have an economic base now. But we're trying to do it in ways that are more environmentally sustainable. So that way we're going to be here for the longer term, and that everything that we interact with, we're hoping is going to be here for the longer term. And our approach of trying to engage Western science really came out of arguments with government, because whenever we would argue for changes in management, government would say, oh, you only have anecdotal evidence. And so we started thinking, well, how do we change that? And so it started with all of the bear work that we did, doing our partnership with Raincoast, and they bought out the bear hunting licenses for us first. And it was a way of being able to try and put our traditional laws into practice, that we don't believe you should kill something unless you're going to eat it. And if you're going to take it, you should use everything that you have of it, because we are not the most important part of the pyramid. We're sort of at the top, but we depend on everything else around us. And so it was just really looking at how do we take our natural philosophies, work with Western science, and find ways where we can work together and see the blind spots we both have, because everybody has blind spots. And the best approach of that whole two-eyed seeing movement that we're getting is then we're able to work together, see things in ways we wouldn't have seen them before. We're able to provide the kinds of scientific reasoning we need for arguments with government to change policy. We've used that in things like the trophy hunt, the closure of commercial crab hunting in and around the First Nations communities on the coast, because we actually need to eat. And so we closed the crab areas right at community by proving that, one, we aren't getting enough every time we go out setting our crab traps. We aren't getting enough to feed the community. We showed how much we rely on it. And it took us something like 4 or 5 years of data to build those arguments. And where that really happened when it built steam was during COVID, because we noticed how food insecure we are up here. When everything shut down and you could only get 3 pieces of meat for any trip to the grocery store, we were getting 1 boat a week, which meant families of 5 were having to live on 3 pieces of meat for a week. They wouldn't recognize that we needed to have some sort of accommodation. We had a really bad salmon season the year before. So we were trying to figure out how are we going to provide protein for our community. And it really just shows that people are as reliant on our wild natural resources as animals are. But we can understand things about our needs as people, but understanding that the ecosystem around us needs that kind of consideration as well is something that I'm hoping these partnerships between traditional Western science, the non-governmental organizations, and First Nations will help to make people understand where it is that we're coming from.
It's absolutely stunning, Jen, and I just, the incredible value of what your community has done in all of this, in recognizing all of these things, and by being I was Jen's neighbor when Jen was an infant. I had a sports fishing resort about 10 miles from where Jen lives, but recognizing that in these remote places you are so dependent on the natural resources, and an understanding of all of those things, of the food security. But because you are there year round, even at that time, I had a settler business. I came and went. I was there during the salmon season, kind of like the bears, and then I went away. But Jen's community is there year round, and year after year after year and generation after generation. So the understanding that is there, the noticing of things like that is so critical, and that partnership, as Jen suggested, with science, with Western science, just gives incredible credibility to what, in many cases, traditional knowledge already understands deeply. So those two things were very powerful. And then also the commitment of of Jen and her colleagues during the work to ban the trophy hunt was incredible. Just the understanding that there was absolutely no reason whatsoever to allow people to come from all over the world and destroy these beautiful creatures, which literally they are part of their community, of their larger community. And so the community of Wichino was very, very strong and very powerful in the work that we did together to help end the grizzly hunt and, ending commercial trophy hunting, period. And so it comes from a deep understanding, from being there from generations, from all of that being passed down, and then that deep commitment to sharing, to recognizing that we're not at the top of the pyramid. We don't get to manage all of this stuff. We have to manage ourselves, as all of our peers in that community, the predators in that community, do as well. And recognizing that food security comes from exactly that. So again, I can't say enough about the work that you've done, Jen, and your community. It just it's so the direction that we need to go.
And for those audience members that might not be familiar or outside of BC, just want to kind of give everyone a little bit of a background in terms of trophy hunting and the grizzly bear hunt. There used to be an open season on grizzly bears, and after 20 years of campaigning, the BC government ended the grizzly bear hunt in 2017. And so, as Brian was mentioning, there was a lot of collective efforts that went into that. And I was hoping you could both walk us through, maybe Jen, you could start walking through us how that journey started and your involvement and what ultimately led to the ban.
We had been trying to ban trophy hunting up here for a lot longer than 20 years. We had started as individual nations because, as the nations within our communities, we found it very wasteful that people would come in, shoot a bear, take only its paws, its head, and its fur, and they would leave everything else to rot. And it really goes against everything within my community that I've ever been told. You take what you need and you give back what you can, because we are interdependent. And we would have these people who would come in, they would have no respect for community, they wouldn't provide anything into the local economic systems within our community. And we weren't seeing any benefits out of having them come in here. And it was creating turmoil within community, because you'd go out fishing and you would find a bear carcass. And it isn't something that is done in our community, to just kill and waste. And so around about 5 years, I guess, before the trophy hunt actually closed, the 4 nations on the Central Coast, the Sakura Nation, Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, we all went to the greater GBI nations and we said, do you guys mind if we pick this up as a group on trying to close the trophy hunt? And so they said, sure, because we only wanted to speak for ourselves. We were very much aware that we can only talk for our nations. We can't talk for other nations, but we can also do the science that we need to get the kind of talking points we need to get people to understand what our problems with this were. And so GBI said, okay. They said, we all agree with this approach. None of us agree with trophy hunting. So sure. And so as the 4 nations, we formed what we called ourselves the Bear Working Group. I don't think we ever thought it was really going to become as big as it did and get as much press as it did. So we weren't really very creative, I guess, in our naming. So we were just the Bear Working Group. And so we sat down and talked about, if we want to change this policy, how do we go about it? What have we tried? And what could we do better? And so we talked about, when we go to government, what have they said whenever we've asked them to close the trophy hunt? They said that it was a huge moneymaker, that hunting was always in the BC lexicon. Like, BC likes hunting, and we hunt too. We don't have a problem with hunting. It's trophy hunting, where you're not eating what you kill. You're not using what you kill other than as a decoration. And so we asked, how can we come back to government with the kind of answers we need to get the kind of change we need? And it was clear that in order to get change from government, you either needed to have money or votes. And we didn't have either. And so we started looking at other organizations who could work with us. And we'd started working with Raincoast on doing some of the bear work before we actually started to use it in our campaign. So we already were working with Raincoast on bear conservation. And we started looking at, how do we shape our research to answer the kind of questions that we need to bring to government to change policy? And so we talked with Chris Darmont, who runs the lab out of UVic, and the bear projects, because all 4 nations had our own bear projects together. And we made sure that our projects were scalable. We were doing individual projects, but we can tie up all this data into bigger pictures, because that's one thing government doesn't have. They manage bears based on paper bears. Like, it's a model. There's this much bear habitat, therefore there's this much bears. But we knew, because of what happened with our salmon collapse, how many of the bears died in that year, that it's not all about just the habitat. There has to be the food as well. And so we shaped our research questions that gave us the ability to argue with government for policy change. And we started looking at, how do we get voters? Because the only way to change government's mind is to get voters on board. So we started looking at a campaign on, how do we get people interested in this issue? And we did a video called Bear Witness. And it was quite a hit. There was a lot of public interest created by it. It spent a month in Science World. We took it on tour to all of the larger universities in BC and just talked to anybody who would be interested about this. And we started finding ways to make sure this issue stayed in the news. So we started creating press releases for other research that we did. We started working with other organizations. We worked with Raincoast, we worked with Lush, and they sold grizzly bear bath bombs just to create funds for the trophy hunt campaign. And we looked at ways to get people interested, because the only way we were going to change minds is if we changed hearts. And so to do that, you need to make it relatable. And so sharing the stories about the starvation of the bears and how much that impacted our community and our children in the community at that time, especially because these were bears they'd see outside their windows for years. And it really was just a very targeted campaign on, how do we weave science and traditional knowledge and public interest to create the kind of change we wanted to see. And when we first started, people were telling us it'll never happen. The lobby is too big. You're never going to get that kind of change. But with the amount of publicity it got, and with us we put in these big signs in all the airports. And the one in Vancouver at South Terminal, trophy hunting is closed in the Great Bear Rainforest. Please respect our traditional laws. Because we couldn't get government to close it, so we just closed it on our own, and that made huge news. Oops, sorry. My cat is interested in the conversation as well. But that made international news. They were shocked that these nations would put policy in place with or without government help. And it's just as traditional laws were starting to get more recognition. And we made sure to figure out something that would get public interest at least every 6-8 months, something like that. So it never really lost the momentum it was building. And we had a change in government, and we had all of these discussions with government before they got in. And they were more open to closing the trophy hunt, but they weren't willing to put it into legislation, just into policy. And so that's one of the concerns that I still have, is that it's still just a policy change. They could still technically reopen it. And so that's why things like these campaigns to buy up the trophy hunting licenses, because that was how we actually, our first stop of the trophy hunt was a campaign with Raincoast to buy up the grizzly bear guiding outfitting licenses. And then we sold hunters to go out and hunt these bears. They were just really bad aims.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the only way that we could do
guide.
it. Yeah, a terrible guide.
So, yeah, one of the things that was really fantastic in it came about as a result of the Secura Nations, the 4 Central Coast Nations research project, working in a river estuary not too far from Jen's community. And when you're working in these places, you're working around bears, and they got to know a number of the bears. And this was a young research team, and there was a doofus NHL hockey player who came in while they were working, and literally while they were doing research on bears, killed one of the bears that they knew. They had called him Cheeky, because when you spend time around bears, you recognize that they have personalities. They have a complex emotional structure, and that forms personalities. And this one was sort of always curious, and not a very old bear, maybe 6 or 7-year-old bear, just coming into reproductive time in its life. And they shot it basically right in front of them. And so when they came over to the boat, the guy held up the head of the bear. They had just basically taken the head and the paws off of this bear. So this was incredibly hurtful, because this was someone who you'd shared the landscape with. And so that became, he holding up the head of that bear became a bit of a poster child in that campaign. And again, that wouldn't have happened. That kind of gross activity takes place on the landscape all the time. It was because, Jen's community and the other communities were out there doing the research on the land, that this was sort of exposed for what it is, for the barbarity that it is. And so, it just was all part of that, being on the land and looking after it and sharing a different view of, like, this was a brother with a name, and not a paper bear. It wasn't a number in a population unit. It wasn't something that was a harvestable surplus. This was a part of their larger ecosystem community, and a co-inhabitant of the planet. And so getting that perspective out, and Jen and the other nations were just such a force at getting that out, and that perspective that, wait a minute, we are looking at this so completely and utterly wrong, that this is a completely uncivilized and unethical behavior. It's really not normal behavior in the natural world. And so exposing that part of it, and as Jen mentioned also, their nations put together an economic study, because there's no ecological reason to kill bears. There's certainly no ethical reason to murder an innocent being, so that you can put its head on a wall. And Jen's community and others got together a really powerful economic study about the value of bears alive versus dead. Do you want to chat about that, Jen?
We worked with Stanford University. We knew one of our arguments with government was always the trophy hunt takes in millions and millions and millions of dollars. We can't afford to lose that within the local economy. But we knew we also didn't have a problem with hunting, and they were grouping hunting in with trophy hunting. And so the economic value, we were looking at what is the actual economic value of trophy hunting, and what's the economic value of ecotourism, because ecotourism was still in its younger days back then. And it was all about, how do we show government that this argument is actually invalid? And so we asked them to come in, talk to all of the people within the Great Bear Rainforest, because the Four Nations really were only campaigning for closing in the Great Bear Rainforest. It was the other nonprofits who were arguing for BC-wide closure, but we were always of the opinion that we can only speak for ourselves. We had agreement from our nations. And so that's what we were speaking to. And so they did talk to all of the guided outfitters. They talked to all of the different communities about how much money they actually take in from guided trophy hunters, how much they take in from ecotourism. And I think it was 1.3 million, something like that, that came in from the trophy hunt. And it was like close to 12 million that came in from ecotourism. And so when we could show government those numbers, because those numbers are very different than what they were saying that trophy hunting brought in, because they were grouping in hunting with trophy hunting. And we had no problem with hunting. We eat a lot of deer. We eat a lot of moose. We eat a lot of wildlife because it's here. It's a part of our history and our traditions. And so we weren't after all hunting, just the ones that are so entirely wasteful and so entirely against everything that we were taught from our ancestors. Because our ancestors had told us that we learned about a lot of what we can do from bears, because we're both omnivores, we have the same kind of space needs. And it actually was proven in one of our other papers that came out of our work that was partially funded by Raincoast, was the bear populations. We looked at how related bears were within areas. And it turns out that bears are related within a boundary, an invisible boundary, because it's not mountains, it's not water bodies. And the researchers were trying to figure out what it was that was keeping all of these bears mainly within these areas. And it was only because they were working with us and they knew our languages and which ones are related to which languages, because at this point we'd been working with them for 10, 12 years. So there wasn't a lot that they didn't know about us by then. And it turns out that that interrelatedness is tied to the languages inside the different communities. And it makes sense, because if there's enough food for us to stay in one place, there's enough food for bears to stay in one place, because it's their mom that teaches them where to hunt, how to hunt, what time to be at this area, because that's when this type of species comes in. When do you go here? Because that's when this starts to grow. And that's what they learn from their mothers, like all of us. And so when all of that started to happen, it really made a difference in being able to prove that there were more reasons why we should close the trophy hunt than there were for keeping it open, because there really wasn't an economic basis. There wasn't a need for trophy hunting like there is for food. And it really was a huge part of how we worked together as Four Nations and how we shaped our science. Who's ringing?
And that's me, sorry. One of the considerations about, how we sort of wound up with the project to buy out these hunting territories is that we work with the provincial government, the wildlife ministry, and we're told the same sorts of things. And as Jen's community and the other Central Coast communities were, that of course we can't close this down. There's too much money involved in it. And recognizing that when we had a change of government, we had actually achieved a moratorium on grizzly hunting in 2001. The government changed, and 90 days later, they rescinded that moratorium. So we started to consider, is there something that we can do that's going to survive these government policies? And the tenure system was set up in the mid 1900s. And these tenures are granted essentially in perpetuity. So we thought, well, what if we just bought these businesses out, and then we operated them in a very, very different way than the guide outfitters are operating them now. We bought the first one out, which was almost 25,000 square kilometers of territory, and we had a grizzly quota with it of 5 grizzlies per year within that territory. We have a very, very specific clientele of hunters, and we just have never been able to find a bear that they really find suitable to kill. So, year after year, we've maintained these licenses, and we do what's required to maintain the licenses. But that has now expanded, as you see in this slide. We now have acquired the exclusive guiding rights to all of the areas in green, and which covers almost all of the Great Bear Rainforest at this point. The area in blue are the 2 territories that we're working on right now, and Jen's community is right at the top edge of the blue. So Jen's community was in the first territory that we acquired. The blue area now will expand that all the way down the coast, past Campbell River, all of Butte Inlet, and into the mouth of Toba Inlet. So virtually the best grizzly bear habitat in the entire world has now come under that control. And at some point, the partnership that we have, the close partnership with First Nations in the Central Coast, we hope to essentially at some point be able to completely extinguish that as a right at all. And we would happily give up that right in a New York minute, as they say, in order to have that closed in perpetuity. And so it was basically an insurance policy against changes. And grizzly bears were the poster child of this, but there are all of the predators, as Jen mentioned: wolves, cougars, wolverine. All of this is all trophy hunted, and so it was basically an opportunity to have over a huge piece of the landscape a functioning ecosystem where predators are not managed as numbers. And so I think I'm really excited that we're getting very, very close. We're probably about to announce tomorrow a campaign. We have a generous donor who has stepped up, and we will have a matching campaign, a matching funds campaign. They will match every dollar that we raise till the 22nd of December, which is our deadline for the purchase agreement for this entire area blue. Another almost 20,000 square kilometers of the Great Bear Rainforest. So it's been a really, really exciting project, and it has dovetailed so much with the incredible partnership that we have with Jen's nation and the other Central Coast nations to just change the whole way that we see predators and change the way that we view our place in these ecosystems. And so for me, it's been an incredible sense of satisfaction of sort of watching that over the last 20 years, or it's only 18 years, the greens start to build and build and build, and just recognizing that, we're able to make this really significant change over such a huge piece of the landscape.
And Brian, you've talked a bit about, I love hearing you talk a bit about the changes that you've seen in wildlife behavior after these purchases. Do you think you can share a little bit about that?
Oh, without question, on a very local basis, um, behavior of wildlife changes really, really quickly um, when they're not hunted. And it's I can give a classic example. It's an inlet that is really depended upon now by the Kitasoo Nation for their bear viewing operation. They invested very heavily in their community, in a I say heavily for their community. It provides employment for over half of the people in the community. A small lodge that does really carefully managed bear viewing. But one of the inlets that we used to go into all the time, I was a tour operator myself. I had a schooner called Maple Leaf for 22 years. We used to go into this place, and there were lots of bears there, lots and lots of grizzly bears. And we would find steaming carcasses. We would find, we knew that there was just lots and lots of bears there, but we almost never saw them. And it was one of the areas that the guide outfitter that we bought out, the first guide outfitter that we bought out, used to take a ton of bears out of there. And so after we bought the license for that area, within a period of 2 years, you would come in and the bears wouldn't be disappeared up into the forest. They would be fishing comfortably along the stream. And it didn't take very long for that to become a very, very common sight. Within 3 to 4 years, we would see between 17 and 20 grizzly bears feeding along 3 little gravel bars in the river estuary. And as people became more familiar with this place, and as the Kitasoo were coming in on almost a daily basis, the bears recognized that people were part of the landscape, but those people didn't end their lives. And it's the same with the research crews that have worked around bears, like the ones from Jen's community that were working with Cheeky and those bears in that river estuary. When they get used to seeing people and there isn't a loud explosion and sudden death, they get pretty relaxed. And that gives an opportunity for people to carefully bring people into these areas to see, just to spend time with them and to spend time with them in their natural environment, not looking at them through the bars of a cage in a zoo, but watching them feed on salmon, watching them feed their young, watching them nurse in a lot of cases when the young are very small. And so you get this whole sense of, bears relaxing around people. The mothers who are very concerned about their cubs, and this has been documented in lots and lots of places now, in areas where bear viewing is quite common and carefully done, a lot of the mums will bring the cubs over to the group and stash the cubs in front of us. And I've had this happen many times myself in times around bears, where they'll leave the cubs with us to babysit because they know that the big male bears won't come anywhere near us. And that frees them up to get the calories they need to be able to nurse the cubs. And so lots of times they'll bring a fish right over to the cubs and drop it, and they'll tussle as siblings do and in front of you over the pieces of this salmon. But you contrast that and the ability to sit there for several hours and just watch these magnificent creatures in their own habitat, asking nothing of us just except please don't kill us, and just watch their lives unfold, and then watch them walk up the valley at the end of the day. It's an incredible change. It's a change in their relationship to us, and it becomes one of mutual trust.
You'll see that in our community too, because the big males don't come into community as often. So usually the mums and the cubs come in, but we do have dogs around, so they won't just stash the cubs anywhere, but they will bring them in and around, and they'll stay inside bushes. They are generally well behaved. And because they don't want to get kicked out of the community, because that's the only place that they can come and still be able to get berries and the grubs and the leaves and all of the other things that they eat before the salmon come in. And so it's just that ability to understand that you are a human in a very natural environment is so different than living in a city when the only thing that you see is pigeons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's really that, it's really key to live alongside the wildlife and not have that separation that you often see in urban spaces. Given that we have about 5 minutes left, I would love to kind of pivot a little bit of the focus to wolves and ask you, Jen, if you have any stories, or what place does the wolf have in your culture and spirituality?
The wolves are really very much a part of the land around us. When we know we have a decent deer population, we know we have a decent wolf population. When the wolves are trying to come too close into community, we know something is wrong, it's out of balance. And it's the same thing with cougars. It's the same thing with any of the wildlife, except for bears, who do come just to hang out. And because the wolves might, except for the fact that the bears are already here, because in their eyes, it's bear territory. And it's very much a part of a lot of our stories about how our land develops. Oh, I'm trying to remember. There was one that I found and it's just gone from my head. You know that when you're trying too hard to think about something and then all of a sudden it's just gone? That's what's happening to me right now. I'm sorry. But we had a pack of wolves who were trying to live here 3 years ago. And they established a den right within community, which is something that's kind of hard for us because they aren't able to leave it. And I'm not sure why they established a den so close to community, but a bunch of our dogs went missing and the community met. Like, if we're going to kill anything, we meet and we have a discussion as a community. And we sat down, we had all of those discussions, and it was decided that if you kill these wolves, then all you're going to do is you're going to break up the pack. It's going to create a power imbalance. It's going to create a power vacuum. They're going to have to fight it all out. And we'll actually have more issues coming out of having to kill 1 or 2 wolves rather than getting them to move on, because they still won't move on. Their cubs are here. They can't move a litter of cubs very easily. And so we just sat here and we waited. And once the cubs were old enough to be on their way, they packed up, took off, and we were right back where we'd been, being able to peacefully coexist. And that's one of the things I think that comes from being stationary in a place, is that we understand that you're only waiting until the next cycle. For us, it was you'd be waiting for the salmon to come in, because as soon as the salmon come in, they take off. We were waiting for the wolves, for their cubs to get of an age where they could move them, so then they take off. And the same thing will happen with cougars when cougars start to come in. And it's understanding we have a place here. And I'm sorry, I wish I could remember what that story was, because I had looked it up specifically.
That was still such a great story and a great example of how you can coexist, especially as a community. And I love that those conversations are had, and, everyone's feelings and possible anxieties about certain situations are acknowledged, and collectively you make that decision. It sounds beneficial for the wolves and the bears and all the wildlife. And I just want to thank you for kind of emphasizing, with your nation's approach to coexistence, it's really that management for wildlife, which unfortunately isn't what we often see in the province's approach. It's managing of wildlife. So I love that we could highlight kind of that, how we can see how it's applied, and, really understanding the complexities of ecosystems. I know we probably don't have time to go too far into this, but just our conversations we've had before about, even those predator-prey relationships you see with the seals and the salmon and the fishermen, and you see it with wolves and ungulates and salmon and people. And we really need to understand, what these predators are eating and what their impacts are on the ecosystems before we start removing them, because it's not just going to impact that deer or moose population, it's going to have such a profound impact on those ecosystems because they all play such a profound role. And it's so important that we understand that before we start messing around.
And are they even the ones that are actually, like, they take one or two, well, not just one or two, but they take individuals. But what is actually causing the problems? Because we don't change the things that we're doing around it. Like, what was causing the problems? A lot of it was the commercial logging, the commercial fishing, and they were creating the problems. But we're trying to manage the bears, not manage the things that are actually creating the issues. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to start doing better, is looking at how those interrelated issues that we create just by living on a landscape, how they affect all of the things around us, because we only look at the economics of something. We don't actually look at the cost benefit for the ecosystem, which for those of us who actually live out in it, it's a negative benefit for us. If you're in the city, you don't experience all of these problems, like the flooding and the slides and all of the other things that come from this, and the predator interactions that get increased because they have less food security. When you're in the city, all you see is you get these nice pictures and you get to go to the grocery store. Whereas for us, when we live here, it's just a very different experience of what's happening in the world today.
Yeah. Well, thank you to both of you. It seems like we are at time, and I just want to respect our audience and both of you in terms of time. And I think that was a great piece to end on. So thank you to the audience for taking the time to join us and all your thoughtful comments. Thank you to our collaborators, the Wolf Conservation Center. If you missed our class with them, you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel to learn more about the ethics of reintroduction programs for Mexican gray wolf recovery in the US. And thank you, Jen and Brian. Thank you for all the time and effort that you put into tonight. It was truly amazing to hear all the stories you shared today. If you want to learn more about the amazing work that Jen does, and also see stunning photos of where she lives, you can follow her on Twitter at Jennifer Walkus and Instagram at Jennifer Walkus. I also wanted to share the Coastal First Nations website as well if you want to learn more. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about Raincoast's Safeguarding Coastal Carnivores program and our current campaign to stop commercial trophy hunting in more than a quarter of the Great Bear Rainforest, you can visit the link below. Also, we are very keen to continue delivering accessible and educational webinars like Wolf School. So we have some things in the works for spring 2024. So just watch for your emails and any updates on that in the new year. Any closing comments, Jen or Brian, before we sign off?
I'd just like to say thank you to all the people who are actually taking an interest, because it is getting people interested that can actually create change. Partly it helps to find the funds to do that. The work that we did, we funded a part of it, but we also had to go and apply for funds because it isn't cheap doing the kind of conservation work that we need to do. It's why government doesn't do it. It's because they can't afford it anymore. And so it's really an important part of building that understanding, is getting people to look at a show that they haven't seen before, looking at a way of thinking that they haven't thought before. And that's what I really like about that collective approach that we're having with Western science and with trying to get people interested and involved, because unless people in the general public get interested and involved, then nothing will change. And I just really appreciate that.
I just like to say what a privilege it's been, being part of this project and working in these communities. As owner, as I said, of a settler business, was really a trophy hunt. I operated a trophy sports fishing operation right near Jen's community. And my journey took me through many of these First Nations communities, and the change in my life and the change in my journey that came from understanding that there's a different way that we can deal with this, that coexistence is fundamental to our survival as individuals, but also as a species.
Mhm.
A huge
Great.
sense of privilege for me.
Yeah. Well, thanks again to both of you, and thank you for everyone that's listening and signed on. Have a great night, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully in the new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Bye.
you all. Bye.